right? But we'll come back to that. So good evening, everybody. It's 7:30. I am, I don't know that we will have as many people as we had last week, because as I was telling Jennifer, we're going to talk about the 10 commandments, but the 11th commandment is you shall root for the Astros in the World Series. So some people are very, I see, Sam, you are dressed for the occasion.
Hat?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, you're all set, and, all you need are some baseballs and some home runs, and we'll be right back in it. So anyway, but we will carry on because you are here. So did anybody bring any questions with them that they wanted to start out with? Going once, going twice. Okay. Hearing none. We will go.
Excuse me.
Yes, I'm sorry,
I was
Shelley.
muted. I do want to make a comment that Jennifer Rosenzweig sends out a few days after the class, the recording of the class, so that if you want to listen to it again, and then there's other things added on. So like if part of the things that are on his program, you didn't get them written down, you can write them down then. It's really, I find it very, very helpful, Jennifer.
Yes. And Jennifer
I'm glad
is
that you did.
exceedingly helpful. I can't imagine doing a class like this without her. So we are all indebted to you, Jennifer. So let me put that outline for tonight back up, right? So what happens after the Israelites get out of Egypt? That's where we left off, right? The Exodus, right? But the Exodus is far from the end of the story. They're in the Arabian desert. So immediately everyone is concerned about water, as if they had never thought about, oh, we might need water, as if the God who had done all the plagues and split the sea for them would just leave them to their own devices. But also, almost immediately, they are attacked by another group who live in that desert, the Amalekites. And the Torah likes the Amalekites even less than the Egyptians. Okay? Why is that? Because Amalek attacks the rear of the caravan with the women and the children and the old people. So God tells after the Israelites fight them off, God tells them, remember what Amalek did to you, blot out the memory of Amalek, and don't forget. Not clear exactly what's meant by that. Blot out the memory of them and don't forget. Okay? But it also says to wipe them out wherever you find them, even though it is pretty clear that the Israelites did not do that, because we see the Amalekites showing up in the Bible centuries later. Right? At any rate, the problem of water is solved. There are wells in the desert. The problem of food is solved for all these people. God sends manna, enough food every day except for Shabbat. Of course, you get a double portion of manna on Fridays. And this is the last time in Jewish history that a Jewish parent will say, God will provide. But that's what happens in the desert. Okay? Now, the next thing that happens is really the point of the Exodus, because God doesn't just bring out the Israelites in order to do whatever they want. And here I have to bring in an issue relating to Jewish holidays, even though most of those will come in much, much later in the course. Every Jew knows at least something about Pesach, Passover. And almost every single Jew, even people who are otherwise totally assimilated, come to the main celebration of Passover, which is the Seder. More about the Seder, again, much, much later. But an awful lot of Jews have no idea that the next major holiday, Shavuot, comes exactly 7 weeks after the holiday that celebrates the Exodus. Shavuot means weeks. And it is a festival that commemorates the giving of the Torah, or at least some parts of the Torah, at Mount Sinai. And as far as the Torah is concerned, Shavuot is just as important as Passover. And this is a very important issue when it comes to taking Judaism seriously. The Israelites are not brought out of Egypt just to do whatever they might want to do, or so they can have a celebration with lots of food plus matzah at, every single year. The Israelites are given commandments. They are given responsibilities and rules, and they are told to be an Am Kadosh, a holy people, consecrated, as it were. Right? This, unfortunately, is why Passover is much more popular, at least outside of Israel, than Shavuot. Passover tells this story about how we became a free people, and we have beautiful meals and rituals that even children can understand. Shavuot says, now you've celebrated getting out of Egypt, it's time to go to work for God, that is. And so not many people are just not as enthusiastic about those responsibilities as they are for the beauty and the celebration of the Passover Seder. So what happens at Sinai? So we're not positive, but we get the impression from the text that at least 10 commandments are given to the Jewish people. Telushkin has this thing, and he mentions it sort of in the book, but it's more impressive when he does it at one of his speaking engagements. And I've heard him do it in more than one place. He will ask the audience, do you believe in the 10 commandments? So people raise their hands or they don't raise their hands, but most do, of course. And he says, great. Can you name them? Right? Well, the fact that the holidays are 7 weeks apart makes the connection very clear. We even have a ritual where we count the days each evening between Passover and Shavuot. Again, much more on that later. God takes us out of Egypt, not just so we can be free, but so we can serve God's purposes. We have to be free because we can't serve God if we are slaves. Now, that said, it is important to remember that the Torah begins not with the laws, but with creation and with the patriarchs, the beginnings of a people. The common Christian critique, also made popular by the philosopher Baruch Spinoza in the 17th century, is that Judaism is a religion of law. Well, the rabbis say that if someone claims only to follow the laws of the Torah, he doesn't hold even onto the law. Right? And similar, they say that someone who follows the laws but has no reverence for heaven is like a treasurer who has the keys to the inner vault, but not the keys to the outer doors. So how's he going to get in? Right? And the sages even warned how one could be a scoundrel even within the laws of the Torah. They said that Jerusalem was destroyed only because they adjudicated cases solely on the basis of the laws of the Torah. but they never felt the need to go beyond what the law required. So, 10 commandments, okay? The first of which it says, I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Now, what's the first thing you observe about this? Anyone? Yeah, Daniel.
It's kind of like when a parent gets some pushback from a small child. And the child says, why do I have to do that? The parent will say, because I'm the parent and you're the child. It's a very like, this gives me, I am the Lord your God, so therefore I have the authority to define all of what you're getting ready to hear.
Yeah, so it's not really a commandment, right? It's a statement, and and all the rest is going to be because I said so. Right? Somebody else was going to say something.
I would say, I just said it's more of a statement than a commandment of what to do or not do.
Yes. First of all, how can you be commanded to believe? How can you command someone to believe? Now, Telushkin deals with that question, and I would go a little farther than he does. Most commentators believe that it is a command actually to believe in God. Others say it's just a statement of fact, but it's so important that we include it together with the others. He also notes that in Hebrew, they are not called the 10 commandments. They're called the Aseret HaDibrot, which really is best translated as the 10 teachings. Right? So, okay, they're not all commandments, right? If you prefer, right? One other thing about this, the last part, it says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the house of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Well, how is it that 7 weeks after Egypt, the Israelites don't know or don't remember that Egypt was the house of bondage? They were enslaved there. How would they not know that? Why does it need to be said? Okay? So there's a very important reason for that, and that is that everyone should remember what Egypt was. In effect, Egypt was the first Holocaust against the Jewish people. Right? Don't romanticize Egypt, because Egypt was hell. It was the house of bondage. And don't forget it. Right? So, maybe the generation. I'm sorry?
May I add this?
Yeah, sure.
We know now from history how difficult it is to get rid of a system like slavery, a civil war, how to get rid of the Holocaust. It took armies to do it. And here's God saying, I did this. I do have moral authority. Yeah. Because, I have the power and ability to even get rid of slavery. I mean, y'all were in slavery for hundreds of years, weren't they? In Egypt, enslaved for a very, very long time. It's not that easy to, get rid of a system like that.
Yes. Yes, Suzanne. You have to unmute yourself.
Sorry about that. As I read this, and I've read it many times, it occurs to me that this may be words, teachings, etc., that are intended not just for the people who came out of Egypt, but they're intended for the future. And therefore, the first one, that took you out of Egypt is apropos.
Yes, because, you may live in Houston, Texas, but it was God who took you, your ancestors, but really your people out of Egypt. So don't forget. Right? Any other comments or questions before we go on? Okay, that's the first commandment. Number 2, you shall have no other gods before me. There's only one God. There's only one number one. In life, you have many desires and many priorities to juggle, right? You may love your spouse, if you have one, I hope you do. You may love your children, maybe not at every given moment, right? But if they ask you to do something that you know is wrong, well, love is not the highest priority. And there are many gods in modern society. We usually call them priorities. Right? Education, art, patriotism. And they're all noble. But if we treat them as gods, then they are wrong. Right? It's fairly simple, fairly straightforward. Okay. Number 3, you shall not carry the Lord's name in vain. God will not forgive the one who carries God's name in vain. Right? Now, as Telushkin points out, this is commonly and wrongly believed to be about how we carelessly and vulgarly use a name of God, as in that goddamn rabbi. Right? Right? I've heard that phrase, so, maybe not from anyone here, but okay. Right? Why would this be the one thing about which it says God will not forgive it? And Telushkin gives a very simple and lucid explanation, and I'll add my own thoughts about it. There are people who speak in the name of religion, and thus for God. Now, I'm a rabbi, and whether I like it or not, I represent the Jewish people. If I were uncomfortable with that, I shouldn't have gotten into the business in the first place. Right? I represent what I understand to be God's will. I'm not perfect, so nobody realistically expects me to score 100%. Well, maybe one of you does, but you shouldn't, right? But in most people's eyes, I do represent not as a stand-in for God, but maybe as the symbolic exemplar of the Jewish people and of what all we stand for. Therefore, I have a higher responsibility to behave in a way that befits that. Right? When I was in rabbinical school, I was living in New York, and there was a big story in the news about a rabbi by the name of Bernard Bergman. Does that name ring a bell for anyone? Bernard Bergman was, yeah. Bernard Bergman was a guy who was an ordained rabbi, but he also owned a number of nursing homes, which were found to be negligent in the service that they were providing to the people who lived in them. All right. And Bergman was fined and went to prison for his role in this scandal. Right. So bad enough it was a Jew who had done this, but also a rabbi. Yeah. Having been a rabbi now for over 40 years, I have known a few bad rabbis, including 2 who actually went to prison. Right? Now, of course, the Christian world has more than its share of problems in this realm as well. The Catholic priests, the Southern Baptists, etc. Right? But my point is that if you represent religion, you have an extra responsibility to avoid misconduct. you are a person who is carrying God's name, right? Which, by the way, is true of all of us Jews to some degree, right? But not the same degree, right? If you claim to speak for God, or at least for God's priorities, then you have to live in a way that is consistent with that. Now, none of us are 100% consistent with it because all of us are human beings, but clergy misbehaving with children, clergy who are adulterers or who steal from their congregations, many people would say that's the lowest of the low. And you know what? They're right. That's pretty bad. Not the lowest, but really bad. Right? So that's what the third commandment, I think, is about. Right? If you carry God's name, you have a special responsibility to do it well. Yes, Daniel.
The word vain strikes me as very St. Jamesy. I looked up the word, and of course it means an over-concern with the way you look, and it also means an attempt to do something that fails. It was a vain attempt to clean up your room, I think was the example. Neither one of those definitions makes much sense to me in this context at all. Is it possible that whatever that word is in Hebrew has an entirely different definition than vain, or synonym than vain?
Well, I'm just trying to give you what I understand to be the intent behind this.
Okay.
The word really does mean in vain, lashav. I don't know exactly how else to translate it, but I think this is what it means. It doesn't mean, a vulgarity. Okay.
Okay.
Now, Josh
No,
Stein posted.
I followed your interpretation. I was just
Yeah. Okay.
confused by the use of that word.
Yeah. So Josh Stein asked a question in the chat, perhaps tarnishing God's name in this world is a grave sin because it creates more enemies of God. I don't know if it creates more enemies, but it certainly doesn't create more people who are willing to trust religion and to refer to religion for what is right. Right? How many Catholics are faithless today, feel unable to turn to religious faith as a source of guidance because they were mistreated by someone who represented religious faith and wisdom. Right? And it's certainly not them alone. Like I said, I've known some really bad rabbis. In fact, I like to think that I have a special handle on that because I grew up in Oklahoma City. Now, why would a rabbi go to Oklahoma City? Okay. It's not exactly a great bastion of Jewish life. The woman who's the rabbi there today she's a wonderful person and has stayed there for over a decade, which is about as long as anybody has managed to stay in Oklahoma City, because it's not a great place to raise Jewish kids. I mean, you can do it, but it's a challenge. It's a different kind of challenge than if you live in a larger Jewish community, even a place like Houston. Well, I have known at least 3 and possibly 4 rabbis in my lifetime who either were expelled from the rabbinical assembly or should have been. Right? Why did they do it in Oklahoma City? Well, I think the reason was Oklahoma City was as far away as you could get from the major centers of Jewish life. It was, halfway between New York and Los Angeles, and it was far enough away from Chicago. And before the internet, if you were physically distant from the big Jewish communities, you didn't, nobody knew about you. So they probably had some kind of misconduct, gotten into a little bit of trouble in the places they had been before. So they went as far away as they could get without anybody having heard about it. And, mostly they got caught in the end. Right? One of them went to jail. One of them was, he didn't do anything legally actionable, but he was in some inappropriate relationships. And another one mistreated his own family. So, Oklahoma, what can I say? My roots. Okay. Other questions or comments at this point? Okay, let's go to number 4. And this is one probably we're going to spend a little more time on than any of the others. All right. Remember the Sabbath day to make it holy. And by the way, you should note that there is a second version of the 10 Commandments in Deuteronomy chapter 5. And there is the biggest difference between the two versions of the 10 Commandments. The only significant difference, right? In Exodus, it says, remember the Sabbath day to make it holy. In Deuteronomy, it says, guard the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Right? It is commonly believed, I think if you ask most American Jews, they would tell you that the goal of Shabbat is to get you to have time off from work. Well, it is true that on Shabbat, you are supposed to cease from labor, particularly creative labor. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But what it says nothing about rest. It says, remember the day to make it holy. And we do this generally in positive and negative ways. There are certain positive things you should do to make Shabbat special and holy. One of them is to light Shabbat candles. This event, even though it was never mentioned in the Torah, it became a standard Jewish ritual for beginning Shabbat. The rabbis added it because so many people mistakenly believed that since one of the Shabbat restrictions has to do with lighting a fire, they shouldn't have lights on in their house on Shabbat. Well, my answer to that is feh, right? Now, Shabbat is supposed to be pleasurable. Shabbat is supposed to be enjoyable. Hence the term Oneg Shabbat, which you may have heard to refer to Shabbat celebrations, because that's what it means, the joy of Shabbat. And why are 2 candles lit? Because of the 2 versions of the 10 Commandments. Remember the Shabbat and guard the Shabbat. Another important example of a positive Shabbat ritual is Shabbat evening Kiddush. Right? In every Jewish home, someone should recite the Shabbat Kiddush on Friday night, which is also a way, in addition to lighting candles, to specifically declare, to make official that this day beginning now is in fact special and sacred. The Kiddush has 2 special Shabbat themes. The first mentioned is Zikaron L'Maaseh Bereshit. The Sabbath is in memory of the creation. Okay? The other, Zecher Litziat Mitzrayim. It's a reminder of the Exodus from Egypt. That this was intended from the beginning for the freed slaves, that they should have a Shabbat. Slaves didn't have Shabbat. Right? Now, there are other special prayers on Shabbat, but these two things are the most important Shabbat rituals. And I mean, as a practical matter, if you don't participate in prayer on Shabbat, if you have at least two, that's that's a good start. Right? But if you just do these two rituals and then you treat Shabbat like every other day in other respects, then you're not really fulfilling the fourth commandment, because there are those things that you have to guard from doing, that you have to keep away from Shabbat. Right? There have to be some things that you don't do because it is Shabbat. One example of that, which is specifically mentioned in the Torah, is cooking. Right? No, in a Shabbat observant household, food for Shabbat is cooked before, it's prepared before. If you have a hot plate, it can be warmed, but it has to be prepared beforehand. Cooking, not lighting a fire, right? You can use pre-existing flames for light and for warmth and so forth, but not for cooking, right? The fourth commandment specifically refers to the word malacha. Malacha is often translated as work. But what malacha really means is creative labor, making something new. If you write something down, you are creating something, even if it's as small as a mark that you made with the pen. You're creating something that didn't exist before. If you are just moving a chair around your house, no matter how heavy the chair is, it might be physically difficult, but it's not making something new. It's not a violation of Shabbat. There are also some things that are not meant to be handled on Shabbat. So, for instance, spending money is not permitted on Shabbat, so we don't handle money, right? You can't light a fire, so we don't handle matches, right? Now, I don't want to get into too many details here, but just a kind of a broad overview of the positive and negative aspects, behaviors, things you do, things you don't do, which go along with the fourth commandment. Let me stop for a moment and ask if there are any questions. All right, hearing none. I want to be clear about something very important, even though it is not the focus of this course. In order to be functionally Jewish, you have to have at least a rudimentary knowledge of Hebrew. Not to be able to speak it fluently, but to be able to read it, to know some of the basic terms that we're going to cover in this class, to be able to recite certain prayers. It's an essential skill if you want to be actively Jewish. There are a few things I'm sure you could just memorize, right? But unless you can read Hebrew, how often would you recite Kiddush on Friday night? Right? How comfortable would you be with Jewish prayer? And how comfortable would you be with saying the blessings if you are called up during the Torah reading? Right? So, and I'll give you an example. Outside of the summer, here at Beth Yeshurun, there's a bar bat mitzvah celebration almost every week. Right? And relatives, grandparents, parents, uncles, aunts, siblings of the bar bat mitzvah are frequently invited to perform this basic ritual, to say the blessings, over a portion of the Torah reading, not to read from the Torah themselves, but just to say the blessings, right? And you would be shocked at how frequently people who have lived as Jews their whole lives are unable to do this properly. I am the Torah reader at Beth Yeshurun, so I see it all the time. Often people will accept this honor because they think they know how to do it, but they are not necessarily competent to perform it. Now, I mention this because I know there are some people in this class who are still learning to read Hebrew, and I want to encourage you to build that skill. It truly is an essential part of being Jewishly literate. Now, the first 4 commandments are really about our relationship with God. The last 6 are about our relationships with others. And over the years of my rabbinate, one of the most frequent questions that I have is something that has to do with number 5, honor your father and your mother. Someone will say to me, Rabbi, my father or my mother was a no good human being. He was neglectful, and when he wasn't being neglectful, he was abusive. Do I have to honor him? So the first thing is, if I know that the person has children of their own, I say, how are things with you and your children? Right? Have you managed to avoid the mistakes that your father made? And if they say yes, I would tell them that's the most important way to honor a parent who was abusive to you, by doing better. I frequently find that a neglectful or an abusive parent is someone who themselves had such a parent, and that's how they learned to parent. But one doesn't honor such a parent by being like them or allowing them to continue to mistreat you or to mistreat your children, right? So now I would never tell someone to publicly disrespect a parent, but sometimes you have to have boundaries. The way you honor such a parent who isn't necessarily deserving of honor is by doing better. I'm sure that some of you are familiar with some of the Jewish laws of mourning, and we'll deal with that much more extensively much later on. Now, one of those laws is that when a family member dies, it is customary for certain relatives to come to the synagogue every morning and evening, and in the course of the service recite a particular prayer, the mourner's Kaddish, together with all the other mourners. For a sibling, a spouse, or God forbid, for a child, this obligation is for 30 days. For a parent, because of the debt we owe to parents, the obligation is for the entire year. So occasionally someone will ask me, am I obligated to do this for a parent who was abusive? My answer is that you are obligated, but for a different reason than other people have. Other people have to recognize the parent that they had and praise God that they were blessed with such a parent. You have to recognize the parent you didn't have and acknowledge the scars from that and praise God that you made it through to adulthood anyway. So that's a little bit about number 5. Number 6 is the most frequently mistranslated of the 10 commandments, maybe the most mistranslated verse in the entire Tanakh. And Telushkin goes through this in detail. I'll just say a couple of words about it. The 6th commandment is not, you shall not kill. It is, you shall not murder. Right? What's the difference? Well, there are times when you are permitted to kill. If you're attacked, you're allowed to defend yourself, even if it means you have to kill the other person. You're allowed to kill in war. Some wars are just wars, right? And very importantly, in Judaism, capital punishment is permitted. Now, there are problems with capital punishment, and rabbinic Judaism put extremely severe limitations on carrying it out, but it is not considered murder. Right? Comments or questions up to here? Okay. Number 7. Right? You know, the most frequently cited joke about the 10 Commandments shows Moses coming down from the mountain and telling the people there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is I bargained God down to 10. Okay? The bad news is adultery stays. Okay? It is an unfortunate fact that in the USA, where most of us think that we are good and ethical people, studies in the past decade indicate that 20 to 40% of married heterosexual men and 20 to 25% of married heterosexual women have committed adultery at some point during their marriage. And most people are at least tempted to commit adultery. You know, temptation is out there, at least for most of us. The issue is not whether you're tempted. The issue is how you deal with it. I'm sure that's something that every adult in this room understands. Judaism is very firm on this point, and the consequences of adultery on family life in America, and unfortunately in many American Jewish families, are just incalculable. And by the way, many people in the Jewish community believe that certain societal problems are less prevalent among Jews. It is my experience that they are often wrong. Mm-hmm. Used to be said there were very few Jews who became alcoholics. Well, if you go to an AA group in a neighborhood where Jews live, you'll find plenty of Jews. Many communities specifically have Jewish Alcoholics Anonymous chapters. I've known a number of other Jews with different addictions, particularly gambling. Okay? It used to be said that Jews never committed fraud. Well, I personally have known quite a few, and some of them admitted it directly to me. As far as adultery, I don't know if it's true in the same percentage as the general population, but I've seen it destroy enough families to where I do not assume that it is any less of a problem for Jews than anyone else. Now, Judaism does accept that sometimes marriages need to end. Divorces are tragic, but in many situations, divorce is the best option for everyone, including the children. But divorce should come before adultery. You know, if you're grown up enough to get married, you're grown up enough to be able to understand when a marriage is not working. Okay, we had a question. What kinds of restrictions did rabbis put on capital punishment? So first of all, they said a person has to have knowledge that in breaking a certain law, they are rendering themselves liable to capital punishment. And they have to be warned, right? They have to be warned that what they're doing could cost them their own life. Well, if these two things alone were consistently carried out, we'd have almost no capital punishment anywhere, right? Because, you know, picture somebody who's about to kill somebody else, and along comes a neighbor and says, don't you know that that is wrong? Don't you know that that could make you liable for capital punishment yourself? I mean, so what's, the guy's going to go ahead and, kill them anyway? Well, maybe they'll probably shoot the messenger first, right? But no, so those alone were substantial restrictions. A third one from a different standpoint, okay? And one that I think here in America we can appreciate, because many of the arguments about capital punishment here have to do not with the fact that it would be unjust, but that it is carried out unjustly, disproportionately against certain people. Okay? So the rule was capital punishment could only be ruled on and carried out by the entire Sanhedrin, which was a group of 71 rabbis. That's a big jury, all right? And if the verdict was unanimous, in other words, every one of the 71 people voted for it, the guy goes free. Because the assumption is that if everybody votes for it, if nobody can make an argument that maybe this person wasn't guilty, that nobody can make an argument that this person shouldn't be killed on account of what they did, then the fix is probably in. And therefore, if everybody votes unanimously for it, it doesn't happen. Right? So those are some of the restrictions that were put on. Okay. Let's go to number 8.
Rabbi,
Oh yeah, Daniel.
correct me if I'm wrong. Israel hasn't put anybody to death since, I'm drawing a blank on his name, the Nazi that
Eichmann.
Eichmann.
Yeah.
That's correct.
Israel has capital punishment only for 2 crimes. One of them is treason and one of them is genocide.
Mhm.
And, treason, I mean, there have been people convicted of treason, but not sentenced to death for it.
Mhm.
So yes, Eichmann was the only person who was put to death in the modern state of Israel. Okay. Other questions or observations here? Okay. Number 8, right? You shall not steal. That's fairly direct, right? We don't need to talk about that a great deal, right? Number 9, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Now notice here that it doesn't say you shouldn't lie. Judaism recognizes that there are times when a lie is permitted in order to preserve someone's dignity. The classic case in Judaism discussed in the Talmud is if you're at a wedding and you're in a conversation where it would be appropriate to say something nice about how beautiful the bride is, and you think that the bride is, to put it nicely, unattractive. The rule is lie. Lie with a straight face. Say, Kala na'ava chasuda, she's a beautiful and graceful bride, even if you know that it's not really true. I mean, here's an example that might actually happen to you. The bride asks you, don't you just love my wedding dress? Do not necessarily say what you are thinking, right? No, it doesn't fit. It's out of fashion. Plus, it's ugly. Now, why would anybody need to hear that on what might be the most important day of their life, right? The 9th commandment is a reference to telling a lie to get someone else into trouble or to get yourself out of trouble, particularly in court. Perjury would be the classic case of that. And in fact, in traditional Jewish law, if you tell a lie about someone else and say that they committed a crime, and then other witnesses come along and say, well, that has to be a lie, and they can prove it, then you, the one who brings false testimony, are punished with whatever the other person would have been if they had been convicted. Right? So that's the kind of lie that we're dealing with in the 9th commandment. Right?
Rabbi,
Yes, Daniel.
when I mean this seriously, I'm not being facetious, but I have a real hard time remembering the laws of Lashon Hara. And-
Lashon hara meaning bad speech, evil speech.
Right, but if I say so-and-so stole something and that person didn't steal something, or I say so-and-so stole something and they did, are those, because one of them's bearing false witness and the other one's just talking about something that is rude
Yeah,
to talk
so
about.
gossip is considered a terrible sin, right? It is not one of the 10 commandments, right? But if you accuse someone of a crime that they did not commit, and you know they did not commit it, or at least you don't have any evidence that they committed it,
That's Lashon
that
Hara.
would be the 9th commandment.
Okay, but the 9th commandment is referring to Lashon Hara, though. I mean,
No,
it's just-
not all Lashon Hara,
Okay,
right? So, sometimes there are things you say about someone and, you're just chatting, right? And you say, I heard that so-and-so might be pregnant. All right. Well, you're not accusing them of a crime, right? You're not even accusing them of having done anything wrong. I mean, they're married, right? But, unless it's public knowledge and you're authorized to share that, that is considered Lashon Hara.
but and this is where I get real confused, because basically what I would summarize to see if I understand it, feed it back to you. You're sharing private information of another person. That to me is gossip, but it's not Lashon Hara. And I'm not disagreeing with you, Rabbi. I just don't. When I hear examples, I think, well, I don't understand this.
So
thing at all.
Lashon Hara can be something which is either public or private.
Okay.
Right? Lashon Hara is talking about other people that you don't need to talk about. Right?
Okay. Well, we'll at some point in the future, whenever
Yeah,
have a
we'll,
private
we'll
discussion.
deal with
and I
that
don't
in
want to
more
slow us down.
detail. Well, let me give you an example. All right. A question that rabbis get sometime is, are we allowed to talk about people in the community who are sex offenders, who are known to be sex offenders? They're legally on the registry, right? So, that has implications as far as, how we deal with them in the synagogue, or even if we allow them in the synagogue when there are children present, right? So that's a question that you have the right to bring up with the rabbi or with whoever is in a position of authority within the synagogue to deal with that. It is not something that you have the right to bring up at dinner with your 10 friends. Right? That's just gossip. It might be true, but it's still just gossip. Okay. All right. Let's go to number 10. We're actually going to do number 10 in time tonight. You shall not covet. And interestingly, Telushkin refers his readers to two biblical stories: King David and Bathsheba, King Ahab and Jezebel. One of them is about a king desiring another man's wife. The other is about a king desiring another man's property. Powerful men are particularly prone to this sin. Now, coveting is not just, wanting what someone else has. If my friend has a Ferrari and I say, wow, I wish I had a car like that, that's not coveting. If I say, I wish I had my friend's Ferrari and let me think how I can get hold of it from them, that's coveting. If I say, I wish I had my friend's Ferrari, how can I get rich quick so that I can get one right away? If you're someone who's willing to consider a get rich quick scheme in order to get something, that's coveting, right? I wish I had a car like that is not going to get you into trouble, right? We've all had wishes like that, maybe not a Ferrari, but, maybe a Lamborghini, I've had times when I wish I said, I've said, I wish I could afford an oil change, right? It's about what you are tempted to do if you really, really want what someone else has. With King David and Bathsheba, if he had seen her and ogled her from a distance and found out that she was married and says, well, even a king can't have everything, then it would have been okay. Maybe, a little bit perverse looking at her from the roof, but not coveting, right? King Ahab wants another man's garden, and Jezebel, his wife, says, I'll arrange it. And, I'll get some people to testify that he committed a crime or he stole it from somebody or whatever, and then you'll be able to take it for yourself. And King Ahab, if he would say, no, I want it, but I don't want it that bad, would have been okay. Serious coveting is the kind that gets you into trouble for violating other ethical boundaries. Now, we've spent a lot of time just on these 10. It's not because the other commandments in the Torah aren't important, and we'll deal with many of them. But a Jew for sure ought to know these and a lot about them. There are lots of people who have studied Torah for their entire life and cannot name all the 613 mitzvot. Right? But you should believe in and, of course, practice these 10 in particular. Now, another interesting fact, the recitation of the 10 commandments used to be part of the daily morning service. It fell out of favor because there's the rest of the Torah. Are we going to say all those commandments too? There was a strong feeling that to recite just these 10 was a little disrespectful to the other commandments. So you will find it in some of our older prayer books, but not as part of the service in modern prayer books. Now, if you didn't know better and you thought that the Israelites went through this experience of meeting God at Sinai, and that now they were all set up to be good servants of God, you would figure they would stay out of trouble for a while, right? So, you should read Exodus chapter 32 for next week. If you read chapter 32, you'll see what actually happened and how the Israelites responded to this. Okay. Thank you all very much. Have a good evening. And
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
we'll see you
The
next week.
Astros are losing. The
Yeah.
Astros are losing 5-0.
Well, we're off to a
Typical.
we're off to a terrific stop.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank
See
you.
you.
Good night.